Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. On today's episode, we are going to focus on the French and Indian War and its impact on George Washington's leadership skills and his tactical skills, both of which will be extremely important in Washington's battle against the British in the American Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. Now, if we're going to talk about the French and Indian War, then we need to ask ourselves two questions. One, what is the French and Indian War? And two, why is this war important? Well, for starters, the French and Indian War began in 1754 and it ended in 1763. It was fought between the British and the British colonists on one side and the French and their Native American allies on the other side. Now, that's not to say that the British did not have any Native American allies themselves. It's just that the major Native American tribes that lived in what we now call the upper Midwest of the United States, they were allied with the French, hence the French and Indian War. Now, why is this war important? Well, it's important because whichever side won, Britain or France, they got to control North America. Now, when I say North America, I'm referring to the lands that we now know as Canada and the United States. The French had already colonized what we now know as Canada, and Britain had already colonized the east coast of what we now know as the United States. Well, the French were pushing further south into the Ohio River Valley. The British were pushing further west into the Ohio River Valley. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't take a genius to realize that if both France and Britain are heading into the Ohio River Valley, it's going to create conflict. Well, whoever wins this war gets to kick the other out of North America. So if France wins, Britain is kicked out of North America or just stuck on the East Coast. If Britain wins, France is kicked out of North America or they're just stuck in Canada. Into this war, into this important time in history, steps a young man named George Washington, who will fight in two important battles that will shape him and the future of North America. The first battle that George Washington was involved in was called the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Now, if you remember from last episode, George Washington had purchased a commission in the military. Well, that military was the Virginia militia. The royal governor of Virginia ordered regiments of the militia, including George Washington, to head to an area that we now know as Pennsylvania today. This is an area where the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers meet. By the way, this is an area that we now call Pittsburgh today. Washington's task was to build a fort in the area to protect it from the French. On May 24, 1754, George Washington arrived in the area. When he got there, friendly Native American allies informed Washington that there were a group of Frenchmen and Native Americans hiding in the woods 15 miles away. Washington took his regiment, marched those 15 miles, and engaged that group in battle. The battle was over quickly. The French surrendered. It was a success for Washington. But unfortunately for him, it would be a diplomatic disaster. After the French surrendered, the leader of the French, a man named Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, was tomahawked to death by one of Washington's Native American allies. After that, 9 other Frenchmen were also tomahawked to death. In all of the chaos and confusion, one Frenchman escaped and informed his commanders of everything that had happened. Now you have to remember, the French and Indian War had not officially started. The French were furious. They argued that this group of Frenchmen that Washington had engaged in battle, that they were a peaceful envoy with a diplomatic mission, not a military force. For Washington's part, he argued that if this was just a peaceful diplomatic envoy, why were they hiding in the woods instead of openly declaring themselves and their intentions? This mattered little to the French. The French put together a fighting force led by de Jumonville's brother-in-law and many Native American tribesmen. They attacked Washington's area on July 9th, 1754. Washington and his men hastily tried to build a fort called Fort Necessity, but the fort was not large and it was not strong. The French overwhelmed Washington and his men were forced to surrender. This would be the only surrender of Washington's career. The French took Washington and his men and released them back to Virginia in humiliation and utter defeat. George Washington's humiliation lasted an entire year. During that year, the French built a fort, Fort Duquesne, in the very area that Washington was supposed to protect. On top of that, the British had not been able to remove the French from that area or to destroy the fort. The British assigned a general named Edward Braddock the task of removing the French from that area. George Washington was named as his assistant. Now for Edward Braddock had one fault that is absolutely fatal in war: the inability to adjust tactics. You see, unlike George Washington, who was born in North America, Edward Braddock was from England. He had fought in Europe. And in Europe, when you have two sides who come together in battle, they fight in an open field, they trade shots back and forth, and then they charge each other on an open field. Well, ladies and gentlemen, North America is not Europe. The Native Americans and the French who had lived in North America, they hid behind trees while firing, and they also wore clothes that camouflaged themselves with their environment. Washington and others tried to warn Braddock that European-style tactics would not work in North America, but Braddock would not listen to them. Braddock said that any man who would hide behind trees, wear camouflage clothing, they were cowards, and that his men would not be cowards. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Braddock was about to march his men into disaster. On July 9th, 1755, while on his way to Fort Duquesne, Braddock and his men were ambushed by French and Native American soldiers, who were, of course, hiding behind trees and camouflaged, so that Braddock and his men didn't know where to shoot or where the next shot was coming from. On top of that, Braddock was killed, and his men were unorganized due to the fact that most of the officers were being picked off as well. It would have been annihilation for Braddock and his men, had it not been for one assistant named George Washington. Washington rallied what troops he could and organized a retreat back across the Monongahela. Washington then rode all day and got the commander from the next regiment to come over and continue to organize and lead the retreat. Had it not been for George Washington, who had 2 horses shot out from under him and over 10 bullet holes in his coat, all of Braddock's men, including Washington himself, would have been lost. Yet Washington's level-headedness and his leadership saved what remained of Braddock's men. All told, Braddock started out with 1,459 men. By the end of that ambush, 977 had been either killed or wounded. The Battle of Monongahela was a disaster, yet Washington emerged from it a hero, with his reputation restored. Now at this point, you're probably asking yourself, wait a second. Every battle you've told me so far has been a complete and utter mess. The Battle of Jumonville Glen was a diplomatic disaster and ended in Washington's humiliation. And the Battle of Monongahela was a complete and utter disaster. Mr. McGee, what on earth are you talking about? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have to remember a lesson of history, as well as life in general. It's what you do in failure that defines who you'll become. Any fool can be great when everything is going well for them. But what do you do when you're greeted with failure, when you're greeted with humiliation, the way Washington was? What you do at that point will define the kind of person you'll become. For Washington, he could have quit. He could have refused to help Braddock because he was humiliated, because of the failures that had happened a year previously. But yet, because Washington stayed the course, because even as an assistant, he still helped out Braddock, still advised him, and then when things fell apart, organized the men and protected as many men as he could, even in the failure of the Battle of Monongahela, Washington's reputation was restored, and he became a man that people knew they could count on later during the American Revolution. Now, if you want to know more about the French and Indian War, I'm going to link my classroom lesson in the description box below. What we need to know for this episode is that Washington left the French and Indian War with his reputation intact and known as a leader that people could count on. In the next episode, we are going to focus on George Washington and the part that he played in the Revolutionary War. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them respectfully and politely in the comments section below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.